7 centuries ago there was a brief war which plunged the people of South Wales into much violence and suffering. Its origins involved greed, trickery, deep grudges and a lot of hatred, particularly of one man whose name has been given to the conflict.
This was the Despenser War, a conflict between the powerful Marcher barons and King Edward II. It began in 1321 and lasted a little over a year. In Wales it is sometimes referred to as the Glamorgan War.
The Marcher barons had been given great powers by King Edward I during his campaign to suppress Wales. In the years that followed, they forcibly acquired more and more land. The key figure was Hugh le Despenser the Younger, who had become chamberlain to King Edward. His father, also Hugh, was a close adviser to the king and was notorious for his enormous greed and harsh treatment of others. Father and son were despised by just about everyone, except Edward. The younger Hugh was King Edward's great favourite. In fact, he seemed to have controlled much of Edward's life. Comments at the time indicate what power he had. No man could approach the king without the consent of the said Sir Hugh. And other comments indicate what many thought about Hugh. He was haughty, arrogant, greedy, evil, and more inclined to wrongdoing than any other man. The spark which ignited the bloodshed was a dispute over land in Glamorganshire. When the Marcher Lord Gilbert de Clare, the Earl of Gloucester, was killed at Bannockburn, Scotland in 1314, he had no children, so his vast landholdings were distributed among others. The lordship of Glamorgan passed to the husband of Gilbert's sister Eleanor, who had married the younger Hugh Despenser. However, the husbands of Eleanor's 2 sisters, Roger de Armory, a previous favourite of the king, and Hugh de Audley, both felt cheated of their share of the land. Hugh had quickly gone from landless life to having great wealth, but he wanted more. He claimed that he had bought the rights to the Gower Peninsula, a claim that was much disputed by others, but with the support of the king, he got what he wanted.
During a time of famine and great oppression in Wales, Llywelyn ap Gruffydd ap Rhys, better known today as Llywelyn Bren, launched an uprising. The king sent a very large force to crush it. The Welsh were hopelessly outnumbered, and Llywelyn offered to surrender on condition that he alone would be punished and that his men would be spared. Many English nobles were impressed by this selfless act, and they wanted Llywelyn to be pardoned by the king. But he fell into the hands of the younger Hugh Despenser. Llywelyn had been taken to London, but he was brought back to Cardiff, and without any trial, Hugh had him hanged, drawn and quartered at Cardiff Castle. This murder greatly angered many lords. Hugh was building up a lot of enemies.
One powerful lord suggested that they should not only rise against the son, but destroy the father along with him. Hugh titled himself Lord of Glamorgan and Earl of Gloucester, which angered many rivals. He was resented for his great influence over the king, and Hugh could do just as he pleased. Edward was completely infatuated with him. It's probable, but not absolutely certain, that they were lovers, but without doubt they were very close indeed, as was said at the time. King Edward loved too exclusively a single individual. And Edward had track record for this. His previous favourite was a man called Piers Gaveston, but powerful lords had him killed, and here it was starting all over again, and Hugh was considered a more dangerous figure than Gaveston ever was. Humphrey de Bohun, the Earl of Hereford, and Roger Mortimer the Earl of March, decided in February 1321 to attack Despenser lands in Glamorganshire. King Edward heard of it and said he'd consider it an act of treason. He twice ordered the marcher lords to meet with him to discuss the issue, and twice they refused. This was blatant defiance. The lords insisted that the Dispensers should answer to the complaints that had been made against them. Otherwise they would no longer have him as king, but would utterly renounce their homage and fealty and whatever oath they had sworn to him. But Edward did nothing. In early May, the Marcher lords attacked Despenser's castle at Newport, which fell 3 days later. Cardiff, Caerphilly, and several other castles were seized in lightning strikes. Despenser's Constable of Neath was beheaded at Swansea. There followed wholesale pillaging, casual murder, and destruction of property throughout Glamorganshire. Hugh Despenser's tenants, mainly peasants and farmers, were brutally treated simply because they were his tenants, a matter about which they had no choice. There followed similar looting and mayhem in Gloucestershire, as well as trouble in the north of England.
The Marcher lords claimed that they were acting in the king's best interests. There may have been a tiny grain of truth in that, but of course they were mainly looking after their own interests. They had unleashed an orgy of destruction and violence throughout South Wales. So as despicable as were the two Hugh Despensers, this was a conflict in which there were no good guys.
The rebelling barons marched to London and demanded that the Despensers be banished. Edward refused, but he was in a very tricky spot. In a face-saving plan, Queen Isabella publicly went on her knees and asked the king to exile them. The charade worked, and the Despensers were, reluctantly, banished from the country. The immediate crisis passed, but tensions simmered, and when Isabella's guard was attacked while she was on a pilgrimage to Canterbury, there was public outrage. Some consider this to have been an incident that was deliberately provoked. Well, it worked, and formerly neutral barons and thousands of volunteers flocked to the king's forces. He was suddenly in a much stronger position.
To make things worse for the Marcher lords, the people of South Wales had had enough of violence and oppression. They rose up in revolt. King Edward marched westward with his forces and overcame all opposition. The Marcher lords' revolt in the south collapsed. It was finally crushed at the Battle of Boroughbridge in Yorkshire in March 1322. And so what we now call the Despenser War was over. King Edward had won, and soon enough the Despensers themselves were back, as badly behaved as ever. They could do just about whatever they wanted.
Queen Isabella, the daughter of the King of France, was sidelined in the king's affections by the younger Hugh. She persuaded Edward to let her go to France with their young son, Prince Edward, allegedly on a diplomatic mission to her brother Charles, who had become king. While there, she evidently plotted with Roger Mortimer, the earl who had been imprisoned by Edward, but had escaped and fled to France. It seems that the two had, at some stage, become lovers, and they plotted Edward's downfall. They eventually returned to England with a small army of mercenaries, which quickly grew with local support. Edward fled west. The king was captured near Llantrisant, north of Cardiff, taken to England, and, most probably, later murdered. And now Isabella and Mortimer could get rid of the hated Despensers once and for all. Not for nothing was Isabella known as the she-wolf of France. The elder Despenser was captured and hanged at Bristol. It was said that his body was fed to dogs. The younger Hugh was also captured and put on trial in Hereford for treason. Of course, he was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was dragged naked through the streets. His was to be a slow, traitor's execution of being hanged, drawn and quartered, watched by Isabella and Mortimer and a crowd of others. After the non-fatal hanging, he was tied to a ladder. It was stated in a contemporary account that his genitals were cut off and thrown into a fire. Then he was sliced open and his entrails were pulled out, before his heart was cut out and his body duly cut into 4 pieces. Hugh had suffered the same grisly end which he had inflicted on the unfortunate Llywelyn Bren.
And so the greedy Despensers were finally gone. The war that bears their name isn't perhaps so well known these days. It's been eclipsed by rebellions, uprisings and conflicts of later centuries. Nevertheless, the Despenser War remains an important chapter in the history of Wales.